What if I told you that two perfectly rational people, both trying to make the smartest decision possible, could it predictably and logically end up in a situation that's worse off for both of them? It's not a riddle, it's a trap. A trap where individual self interest leads directly to collective failure. This puzzle explains everything from why elite athletes risk their health in doping scandals to why powerful nations spiral into devastating arms races. It's a fundamental paradox of strategic thinking, and it has a name: the prisoner's dilemma. So, in this video, we're going to explore how the dilemma works, why it matters, and how its tragic logic shapes some of the most consequential decisions in global politics. Imagine two suspects are arrested for a serious crime. The police have enough evidence to convict them for a minor offense, but not the major one. So they isolate the suspects in separate rooms and make each of them an offer. Each prisoner is told, if you betray your partner and they stay silent, we'll let you go, and they'll take the fall and do the 20-year sentence. But if you both stay silent, you'll each get a lighter sentence for a minor offense and you'll serve 2 years each. And finally, if you both betray each other, you'll both do a moderate sentence and serve 8 years. The dilemma is this. Each prisoner has a strong incentive to defect, to protect themselves by throwing the other under the bus. But if they follow that logic, they'll each wind up worse off than they would have had they cooperated. This is the core of the prisoner's dilemma. The best individual outcome comes from betrayal, but when both players follow the same logic, they wind up in a result that's worse for both. And here's the twist. It's not because either of them made a mistake. They followed the logic of self-interest perfectly. And that's exactly what makes this such a powerful and troubling model. Now, let's break this down a bit more formally using a tool called a payoff matrix. Let's call the two players prisoner A and prisoner B. Each has two choices. They can either cooperate, remain silent, or they can defect, betray their partner, and confess. And if we plug our previous example into this matrix, it looks like this. If A talks, in game theoretic terms, we call this defecting, and B cooperates, that is, they remain silent, A walks free and B gets the 20-year sentence. That's A's best outcome. Conversely, if B defects and A cooperates, A gets the 20 years and B goes free. If neither talks, that is, if they both cooperate, they'll each do 2 years, and if they both talk, that is, they both defect, they'll do 8 years each. Now, to make this simple, let's rank the choices here. For each person, their obvious first choice would be to go free, so let's rank that 1. And doing 2 years is obviously better than doing 8, so let's rank that 2, our second best choice. Doing 8 years would be better than 20, so let's call that our third choice. And that leaves 20 years as our fourth or last choice. So we've built out the full matrix, and we can now see how the logic of the game plays out. But remember, we have to make our decision without knowing what our partner will do, so let's look at this from player A's perspective. If B cooperates, A does better by defecting. After all, this is their best outcome. Conversely, if B cooperates, A still does better by defecting. While it's their third choice, it's better than cooperating, which would yield their last or least favorite outcome. So no matter what B does, A is better off defecting. That means that defect is A's dominant strategy. It gives the best outcome regardless of what the other player chooses. And the same here is true for prisoner B. If A cooperates, B does better by defecting, getting their first choice outcome. If A defects, B still does better by defecting, getting their third choice outcome instead of their fourth. So B also has a dominant strategy to defect. And here's the paradox. If both players follow their dominant strategy, if they both defect, they both end up with their third favored choice, a worse outcome than if they were both to remain silent and cooperate with one another. This is what makes the prisoner's dilemma so powerful and so frustrating. Even when players are rational and when they both want to avoid the worst-case outcome, the logic of self-interest necessarily leads them to a result that's worse for both. The outcome, where both defect, is what game theorists call a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies where no player has an incentive to change their choice, given what the other is doing. But, and this is key, that doesn't mean it's the best outcome overall. Think about this. Both players would prefer mutual cooperation to mutual defection. This brings us to a key concept for evaluating outcomes: Pareto efficiency. An outcome is considered Pareto inefficient if there's another possible outcome that would make at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off. The Nash equilibrium of mutual defection here is therefore Pareto suboptimal because the mutual cooperation outcome exists, where both players are made better off. In other words, it's a stable outcome but not a socially efficient one. Cooperation would make both players better off, but fear and self-interest keep them from getting there. In fact, the cooperative outcome is Pareto optimal, meaning no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. So here's the dilemma. Rational players choose their dominant strategy, but in doing so, they wind up in a Nash equilibrium that's stable but Pareto suboptimal. And in doing so, they miss the chance to have an outcome that they both would have preferred. That's what makes the prisoner's dilemma so compelling and so important in international relations. It reveals how rational strategies can produce irrational outcomes at the systemic level. Now let's take the logic of the prisoner's dilemma and apply it to one of the most important and dangerous episodes in modern international relations, the Cold War arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. In the decades after World War II, both the United States and the USSR said that they wanted to avoid nuclear war. Neither side wanted to use these weapons. Both recognized that any major conflict would be catastrophic. But despite those shared interests, each country spent decades building up ever larger and more destructive nuclear arsenals. Why? Because the strategic structure of the situation mirrored the prisoner's dilemma almost perfectly. Let's define the actions. Each side could cooperate, limiting weapons production and restraining military buildups, or they could defect, expanding their nuclear arsenals to pursue military superiority. The payoffs? If both sides cooperate to limit military spending, they avoid massive costs, reduce the risk of war, and preserve mutual security. If one side defects while the other cooperates, the defector gains a significant advantage: greater deterrent power, global influence, or even a first strike edge. But if both sides defect and arm themselves, which is exactly what happened, they both spend more, fuel mutual suspicion, and increase the risk of accidental or preemptive war. In this case, each state prefers to avoid vulnerability more than it values the cost savings. So even though building more weapons is expensive, it's seen as the safer bet, especially if you assume the other side might build up too. And yet, from the broader perspective, the smart move would be for both sides to disarm, maintaining the global status quo at a much lower cost. So, just like in the prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium is mutual defection, an endless arms race, and the Pareto optimal outcome, arms control and cooperation, is left on the table. And this is exactly where we see another powerful idea emerge in IR theory: the security dilemma. In a security dilemma, one state takes steps to defend itself, like increasing its military capabilities, but those defensive moves look threatening to others who respond in kind. Before long, all sides are locked in a cycle of escalation, not necessarily because they seek conflict, but because they fear being left behind. The security dilemma shows us how rational, even peaceful states can end up in a cycle of confrontation, not out of aggression, but because each side is responding to the incentives and fears built into the structure of the game. That's the logic of the prisoner's dilemma, and as we'll see, it doesn't just apply to superpower rivalries. It shows up in everything from nuclear proliferation and trade wars to climate change and peacekeeping operations. This model closely fits with realist assumptions in international relations that states operate in a world of anarchy, pursue self-help, and prioritize sacrifice over competition. From this perspective, mutual defection, like an arms race, is not irrational. It's the logical result of a system where no higher authority can enforce cooperation. But liberal theories also use the prisoner's dilemma to highlight the importance of institutions, communication, and repeated interaction in changing incentives, making cooperation a more rational and achievable outcome over time. So, why does the prisoner's dilemma matter so much for international relations? Because it reveals a powerful and disturbing truth. Even perfectly rational decisions made by cautious and self interested actors can produce outcomes that are bad for everyone. It's not a failure of leadership, it's not about bad intentions, it's a failure of the structure. When individual incentives are misaligned with the collective good, conflict becomes not just possible, but likely, perhaps even inevitable. We call this the tragedy of rational behavior. You follow your best strategy, the other side does too, and together we all end up worse off for it. That's why the prisoner's dilemma isn't just a classroom exercise. It's a model for some of the most persistent problems in world politics. How do we manage arms races? How do we build trust? How do we create systems where cooperation is actually the rational choice? So, to recap, we've explored the logic of the prisoner's dilemma, a game where rational choices by self interested actors can lead to mutually worse outcomes. But what if we could change the game? In upcoming videos, we'll look at how cooperation can emerge over time, even in the face of strategic competition. We'll explore repeated games, reciprocity, and the shadow of the future, and how these ideas help explain institutions, alliances, and trust in global politics. If you've got any questions, thoughts, or examples you want to share, go ahead and drop them in the comments section below. I always appreciate seeing how you're following along with the material that we're covering. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.